that quiet, reflective quality that I see in Norse, and indeed in the best poets, Whitman included. You know, I guess both of them really owe a lot to Walt Whitman. Whitman starts a whole new sense of American literature and poetry that is basically vernacular, down to earth, yet eloquent in its own way. Which one is closer to Whitman's spirit? It's hard to say. There's a showy quality in Whitman, as in Ginsberg. I don't know. Knowing so darn little about what makes a good poem or a bad one, and only knowing what appeals to me, I don't have a clue as to why Norse is not better known or more celebrated. I think he deserves to be.
Mm.
You know, Manuel, I wonder if Norse's very obvious attack on homophobia may have offended some. No idea. What do you think?
I don't really know. I do know that when you were talking about Whitman's relationship to Norse and also Ginsberg, the first thing that popped into my head was the publisher of Bukowski, the guy who kind of rescued him to become a writer in his own right, you know, to quit his job. John Martin, his patron, the publisher of Black Sparrow Press before he went defunct. And John Martin often compared Bukowski's poetry to Whitman. Basically, he liberated the language so that people could actually relate to what, you know, the poet was saying. And this is a kind of a dying phenomena, as we know, because most people today don't read poetry to each other like Blake read his poems naked to his wife in his backyard. Or I think he was reading Milton, actually, to his wife naked in the backyard. And that kind of practice is no longer, you know, very common. I'm not saying Blake was very common, but today the idea of reading poetry is associated with being, you know, boring, literary. I think Bukowski used to say that when he was growing up in L.A. back in the 30s, in the Depression, for a boy to write poetry was to be a sissy. Yeah. You know, something that Norse, of course, echoes in his poem too. But what do you think is the status or state of poetry today?
I don't know. For whatever it's worth, we certainly don't have a successor to the beat poets, anyone who can really command that kind of audience. No, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm kind of interested. You know, since the 1990s, there's been a kind of phenomena of street poets, especially in those kind of slam poetry things. So often it's very showy. It's not very introspective. It's just for kind of sort of almost an extension of hip-hop in some ways.
Yeah, right.
But there's some interesting, you know, things that people are doing. It's almost like almost, not exactly, but a verbal equivalent of graffiti, you know, which is, of course, a street art that Norman Mailer talked about in Faith of Graffiti. And it does have a ritualistic and also a very direct link, you know, to culture of the streets. And it seems to me people like Norse, Bukowski, and definitely Ginsberg too, wanted to have some kind of relationship to the streets. You know, I mean, Burroughs definitely, I mean, even though he was a bit of a Southern gentleman, you know, from the Burroughs, it was a cash register family. You know, he was interested in hanging out with all the dope fiends and derelicts of New York City. Like you can see in his earlier novels like, what is it, Queer and Junkie. And this seems to me a tradition that goes all the way back to even the Wobblies, because the Wobbs always had this relationship to street people. You know, people who are not considered workers,
sure,
they consider themselves proletariat. And
well, a lot of this is a reaction against the very stultifying, rigid bourgeois culture of the 1950s, with its conformities, its extensive taboos, its generally uptight quality, its obsession with conformity, its image of suburbia as paradise. All of that starts collapsing. And the beat poets are pretty much the voice of transgression. I won't say protest, they weren't that focused, but they had an alternate vision. Norse has a diatribe against Billy Graham in there, one of his poems. And Billy Graham, although he's probably the most decent of the evangelists, did pretty much express a certain kind of spirit, a sort of bourgeois, middle class religiosity, a Christianity without a social gospel element in it at all, a cult of individual perfection and salvation, all of that. And it's interesting to me that so many of these poets turn to Zen, to Buddhism, to alternative modes of consciousness, to a mystical tradition of one kind or another. And it's striking that Norse does that pretty much on his own, before he has any contact with these others. So I think all of this has to be seen in that particular cultural context. Now, to get back to the question of what's happening today, well, I'm left without anything to say because I don't know how to characterize the broader social attitudes toward the dominant values, what have you. It strikes me that this is a period of ennui, a period of quiet resignation. There's neither the bold assertion of values of bourgeois capitalism that you had in the 50s, nor the kind of spirit of a counterculture of the 60s. Instead, you get a sense of a kind of dullness. As if a large part of our consciousness were anesthetized. Now, how does poetry fit into that?
That almost sounds like a metaphor for postmodernism, with its focus on fragmentation.
Wasn't that pretty much the key to postmodernism?
Absolutely.
I see it as such.
So do you think in order to revive poetry we have to in a sense, be against postmodernism?
I think what we have to do is see postmodernism, as you have often described it, as a cultural expression of late bourgeois capitalism, and put it within an historical context, and not regard it as some kind of final answer to basic epistemological and critical and historiographic questions. I was very pleased with one guy in my seminar who saw that very clearly at the end of our session, that and once we do that, we move beyond it, I think.
And we do that by writing poetry on the basis of understanding our time as being, in a way, postmodern, to work with it, not to deny it, not to say we're going to go back to the good old days, but to focus on the bad new days, to use Brecht's term.
Well, part of the function of art, I think, is always to liberate and transcend reality by the description of reality. In other words, part of the therapeutic value of poetry is if you can put despair, you can give it a face, and give it images and words, you've robbed it of a lot of its power. It's the